Hello, everybody, and welcome to this EUA webinar about the impact of the pandemic on international cooperation. It's part of our series of webinars about the impact of geopolitics and international events on higher education and research, and maybe a little bit looking out to the future. My name is Thomas Jørgensen, and I am moderating some people that are much more clever than I am to tell you a little bit about what happened. Evidently, geopolitics is a topic that's as relevant as ever, particularly since the Russian aggression and war against Ukraine. And that particular situation we're going to talk more about. We'll have a webinar about science diplomacy in that perspective in May, and that is of course a really important topic. However, what you can say is that if you look at international cooperation for universities, there's been two shocks. The one is the one that's on our mind right now all the time, the war. But before that, evidently, we had the shock of the pandemic, COVID-19, COVID-20, 21. Let's hope we don't get a COVID-22. And that's what we're going to talk about today. It's a topic that EUA has been monitoring since the very beginning. If you look at the handout section on your right side, then you'll see that you can have there's a link to a snapshot of the situation not long ago, how it was around Europe. And if you go on our website, you can find much more. We've also put a handout, given the crisis in Ukraine, to the page where we gather initiatives particularly to help Ukrainian refugees and Ukrainian scholars at risk. So we put that in as well. So that's the layout for today. The pandemic. What was the impact? What was the impact globally? What was the impact on mobility? What was the impact on research, particularly on open science? On a technical note, you should be aware that we're recording this webinar. We'll put all these webinars on YouTube, and you can watch them later there. Again, if you go to the handout section, there is a link to the whole webinar series. We had 3 webinars in the autumn as well about similar topics that might be interesting. So you're very welcome to look at this. You're very welcome to ask questions at any time that something comes into your mind. Again, on your right hand side, there's a Q&A tab, and please ask your questions there and not in the chat, because as you can see, people are very nice and say hello in the chat, and we risk to lose your questions. We look for them, but it's much better if you put them in the Q&A section. So that was introduction, a little bit of technicalities. Let's see how we get into the actual facts about what happened during the last 2 years. And it is really 2 years almost to the date, at least here in Belgium, that we went into lockdown. So 2 years of pandemic. What is the consequence? And we start with the global perspective. Giorgio Marinoni, who's manager of higher education, internationalization, policy and projects at the International Association of Universities. And he has been looking at this. We've been talking about this for 2 years now, Giorgio. So he'll now give you an overview about what are the consequences that we've seen. So Giorgio, please.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and good afternoon to everybody. So as Thomas said, I will briefly present the global impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on higher education. Of course, it's a very huge topic, so I will just give a brief overview of the most important results of surveys that we conducted on this aspect. So as you know, in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic was a surprise to everybody, and it was a surprise also for higher education world. So there was an immediate need to react, but also a need to understand what was the impact of COVID-19 on higher education. And for that reason, the International Association of Universities launched already in 2020, in March, April, a very quick survey to monitor this impact. And you can see here in the slide, there is a report available on the website. But that was a very quick survey that could not capture real impact of the pandemic on many different aspects. So 1 year later, we conducted a second survey, much broader, which had two different aims. One, again, to measure the impact of COVID-19 on higher education 1 year into the pandemic. And the second one, to measure institutional responses to the pandemic. The survey was not just an IU action, but it was done in cooperation with different partners and association also member of the IU. And here I want to mention that the European University Association took a very important role. So I want to thank EUA for their contribution in the survey and also for having invited me today to present the result here. Just very quick general information on this survey, this second edition, was an institutional survey. So we asked only one reply per higher education institution, and we wanted to capture the institutional perspective. This is quite important to say. The data was collected between the 15th of February and the 1st of June 2021. So now it's almost 1 year has passed. So some results might have changed. This is something important to keep in mind. We got 496 replies from higher education institutions in 112 countries and territories. So we got a quite nice global distribution. We are covering a lot of countries. And the number of replies was enough to have a statistical relevant analysis at a global level, of course, but also at regional level in 4 regions of the world, which you see here: Africa, the Americas, Asian Pacific, and Europe. We were also able to conduct an analysis of private and public higher education institutions. You might wonder why there is this strange region, the Americas. The reason is that the replies from North America were not enough. So we had only few replies and we couldn't create a region North America. We had to put the Americas together. But as you can see, 92% of the replies of this region, the Americas, are coming from Latin America and the Caribbean. So when I will present the result, keep in mind that Americas, it's a lot Latin America. How the survey was constructed? The survey was divided in 4 parts. The first part was dealing with governance, second teaching and learning, the third one research, and the fourth one on community, societal engagement. And here I have put internationalization as a transversal priority because we consider that internationalization is a transversal priority. So questions on internationalization were included in the different parts of the survey, but there was not a dedicated part to internationalization. But let's come to the most interesting part, which are the main results of the survey. And here in 2 slides, I will present what, in my opinion, are the most interesting results that came out from this analysis. The first one is that higher education institutions around the world demonstrated resilience. So there was a lot of people were afraid at the beginning of the pandemic. How will higher education institutions react? But in reality, what we saw is that the higher education institutions really demonstrated resilience. The other second and very important result is that the impact of the pandemic on higher education has been very uneven. We see different impact in different regions of the world, but also different impact of the pandemic between higher education institutions in the same region of the world. And this is something to keep in mind. We also see that there are not only negative effects of the pandemic, but the pandemic, for instance, has stimulated innovation and has accelerated some transformation. One, a striking one, the transformation towards remote teaching and learning and distance teaching and learning. However, even if this transition to distance or blended learning is clearly the most relevant change, which can also be sustained once the pandemic is over, we have to keep in mind that it's not the solution to all challenges, and even it creates new challenges with its introduction. On the research side, we saw that the impact of the pandemic is less pronounced, but this does not mean that it's not important. It's still important. And again, we see an uneven impact among eyes in different regions and also eyes in the same region of the world. And last but not the least, also on community societal engagement, we see a very uneven impact among regions. For instance, we see a clear difference between Africa, where community engagement has decreased, and Americas, where community engagement has increased, but also a different impact among eyes in the same region. And last but not the least, we have to remember that at the time of the survey, and unfortunately even now, the pandemic has not ended. So the situation is still changing rapidly. So something which is true or was true 1 year ago might not be true now. And the other thing is that some consequences might be more long-term. and cannot really fully evaluate it at the time of the survey and either now. And this is the case, for instance, for changes in strategies and curricula, which are going to present briefly after. And let's have a look at the main topic of today, international cooperation. So what we see as a result of the survey on the impact of COVID-19 on international cooperation. The first result, we see that there was a decrease in expenditure for international cooperation and activities in all regions. The question is this decrease temporary or is it structural? Will it remain? We don't know the answer to that question, but we have different ideas. For instance, we see that research activities have been delayed, but the main reason was travel restriction. So we can assume that once the travel restriction will be removed, the decrease in expenditure might go away. The university will again invest in those activities. But on the other hand, for instance, we see that research funding from foreign governments and international organizations has diminished at some eyes, and especially in Africa. This can mean a structural diminution of expenditure, so a real change due to the pandemic. On academic partnership, we ask different type of partnership, and here I will show you two of them, which I think are the most interesting at international level. One is for student mobility. I will be fast here because I know that Ulrich has a lot to tell you and much more on this topic. Again, we see an uneven situation, but we see a decrease in partnership for student mobility, and especially we see a decrease in Africa and in Europe. Going to partnership for international collaborative learning, this is maybe one of the most interesting results because we see an increase in the Americas, which might be expected, but we see again a very uneven impact, and we see a substantial number of education institutions where these partnerships have decreased, and this might be surprising. At the level of the change of internationalization strategy, as I mentioned before, this is something which cannot really be captured now because the majority of education institutions replied that they were thinking about changing the strategy, and only 31% of them had already changed it. At the regional level, we can see that there is a quite difference between region and region. For instance, half of institutions in America already changed the strategy, but on the other hand, in Africa and especially in Europe, there is even 1/3 which have not, so they are probably not thinking about changing their strategy. At the level of prioritization of activities in the strategy, we see an increased importance of virtual exchange and collaborative online learning, but also internationalization of the curriculum, internationalization at home, and academic and administrative staff training, which might be a positive result of the pandemic. We see a much more uneven impact on everything that concerns mobility, student or staff mobility. Coming to research collaboration, we have to say that from our result, research collaboration has not changed at the majority of our education institutions, so the impact seems to be less on research. However, we can clearly see that at the regional level, we have different results, and especially in Africa, we can identify 3 different groups of almost the same size. On the other hand, which is positive, in Africa and in the Americas, we see that the group of higher education institutions which increased research collaboration and also quality of research collaboration is the biggest one. So, one last consideration is what's going to happen beyond the pandemic. So this was in a very quick overview, the impact of the pandemic. But we have to keep in mind that COVID-19, it's not the only factor affecting international cooperation. We have also change in geopolitics, as Thomas introduced before. We have the digital transformation of education, and we also have the sustainable development agenda. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go more in detail in each of these topics, but I might add some slide on very few consideration of these 3 topics and when after the webinar, and will be shared with you. So let me conclude with 3 conclusions out of the impact of the pandemic on international cooperation. The first one, it's clear. The pandemic has shown that global challenges, as the pandemic itself, can only be solved globally. The second one is that the contribution of the education community to society is needed now more than ever. But unfortunately, the lesson has still to be learned, and we can see it, as also Thomas introduced, by the situation with Russia and Ukraine at the moment. Instead of cooperating, we are still seeing a war in Europe, something that would have thought being impossible. And last but not the least, more collaboration still remain paramount, still remain very important, and it's up to our education community to create this collaboration at global level to create a better and more sustainable future. Thank you very much. Here I put a link to the report. You are welcome to download, and I hope that you will have a good read. And if you have questions, I will be happy to reply to them after the presentation of Ulrich and Inge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Giorgio. That was a really exciting overview over how it looked also continent by continent. Something that really only your association can do. I think you put your finger on really the big question: is this temporary or is it structural? I think that is really something to bear in mind. And the second one, that's of course more normative: are we changing? Have we changed in a good way, or in a way where we maybe would rather want to go back to the old normal? And I think, Ulrich, you will also talk a little bit about those issues. Now we have questions in the question and answer tab on your right side. We will take them, as Giorgio also said, we will take them afterwards. If there's some questions you particularly like, I think that was exactly what I would have asked, or I'm really happy that this question was asked. Give it a thumbs up, and then if we have too many questions, it'll be easier for us to prioritize. But back to the presentations, diving more into the question about international mobility. Very happy to have with us the president of the Academic Cooperation Association, Ulrich Grothus. It's an association of national funders and promoters of mobility and academic cooperation, to tell us about what happens to student mobility under and maybe a little bit after, with an outlook as well. So please, Ulrich, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Thomas, for your kind introduction, and thank you, Giorgio, for a very stimulating presentation. Thanks, EUA, for inviting me to this webinar. EUA and ACA have collaborated and continue to collaborate on a number of issues, and I'm glad that we're doing so also today. You have already mentioned that ACA is an umbrella organization of funding agencies in Europe. Mainly in Europe, we have some associate members from beyond Europe, but currently there are 19 agencies that are with ACA. One of the paradoxes of this crisis has been, and I think that has happened not only with us, that actually members were working more intensely together than they had been in the past. In the past, we were meeting for physical meetings or conferences 3 or 4 times a year, and now there are a number of working groups that convene every 2 or 3 months online, and one of them that was created right at the beginning as the pandemic has dealt with COVID and its consequences for the international education community at large and for our membership in particular. Much of what I will say is based on what I've learned in that group myself. ACA has also published a series of think pieces in 2020 and 21 that you may like to have a look at. In this talk, I will focus on 2 main issues and 2 main points. One is, what do we know about the impact on mobility, degree mobility, credit mobility, and faculty mobility? And second, what lessons may be learned for a post-pandemic time, whenever and if ever this time will arrive. Let me start with degree mobility. People in our community sometimes forget that most mobile students are not Erasmus students or study abroad students, but study at another country for at least 1 study cycle to complete a degree abroad. Over decades now, more than 30 years, roughly 1.5 to 2.0% of all students worldwide have been internationally mobile. So with the increase of numbers of overall student enrollment, also the number of internationally mobile students has increased. We first thought that it would decrease over time with the building of independent higher education systems in the global south, but that has not happened. There's one caveat: in some national statistics, including in my own country, Germany, degree and credit mobility are not always properly distinguished. So what have we seen? And as you see in the title, my impression is that the impact of the pandemic on degree mobility was strong, but still limited. At first, we have seen a very sharp fall in new enrollments, in particular in the United States, in Australia, but also in European countries. That was in academic year 21-22. In addition to that, many of the students newly enrolled and also already enrolled studied online from abroad. That number was close to half in the United States, and in Australia is still a fourth in Germany. And one needs to say that the statistical category of degree students not attending live was not even in existence. So we don't know what the comparison would say about years before 2020. Now comes the surprise, because the pandemic drew on much longer than we would have thought and hoped, but still we have seen a very strong recovery in new enrollments in most countries in the current academic year. Numbers went up 68% in the United States, 11% in Germany, but then the fall there was also more limited, 14% in the Netherlands. And that is true for most countries except China and Australia, who practically closed international travel to their countries, including for students. And that, of course, is reflected in the number of students newly enrolled there. Still, in many countries, enrollments are below the levels that we saw before the pandemic in 2019. So, as I've said, the number of enrollments and student numbers does not only depend on the pandemic itself, but also on the travel and health situation and restrictions that was in vigor in different countries. Access to visas did matter, particularly for smaller countries that practically closed many of their consulates. We've seen a shift in the composition of the international student body. China went down worldwide, India went up in most countries, EU obviously went down in the UK, Francophone Africa went up in France. So we see important changes in the student flows. It's very difficult to predict what will be the midterm impact on numbers and destinations, because what we've seen in 2021 and 21-22 were students who already mainly had made up their plans for their education before the pandemic started. And now we have students that finished secondary school during the pandemic. And of course, it's very difficult to predict how they will react to the new situation, whether they will have discovered new countries of destinations like continental Europe and might stick to that in the future. So we simply don't know. We also don't know what will be the impact of the deglobalization we see in many spheres now. What will be the impact of that on future student flows? What seems to be sure, that issues of health and safety will have a much bigger role in the decision of students than they used to have in the past. And with the current war, that may be even more the case than before. Let me now come to credit mobility. So credit mobility is defined as students who spend up to a year abroad and earn credit for their own home universities and complete their studies there. So that is the Erasmus type of mobility. One also needs to say that the only reliable and comparable data, except for the United States, for credit mobility are figures for Erasmus, and Erasmus accounts only for 1/3 to 2/3 of credit mobility in Europe. So that is an important but still a limited view. Also, one needs to pay attention to the fact that some of the figures we know about the fall term 21 are basically figures of what universities thought their students would do and were planning for, and didn't actually know if they had really moved or just planned to move before then Omicron set in. But I've learned this morning in a meeting of our COVID working group that effectively actual physical mobility under Erasmus has again dramatically increased in the fall term, is still in most countries considerably below pre-pandemic level, but has largely recovered. Even students who had postponed their stays abroad now picking them up. So as I said, we've seen a crash in credit mobility under Erasmus in 2021. Germany, for example, minus 41%. In the United States, minus 51%, and 99% for the most popular type of study abroad in the United States, that's summer terms. Ever more Americans go abroad for ever shorter periods of time until nobody will go for no time. Everybody will go for no time. And this was already true for the summer term mobility in the last academic year. One important issue that we see pretty little interest of students in virtual mobility. In Germany, for example, only 1.5% of Erasmus students studied online, whilst many studied online from Germany, whilst many traveled to their home country and studied online from there because they wanted to have the international experience, if not in the classroom, then in the street. Of course, there is a huge impact of factors, of short-term factors, of local developments in the health crisis for credit mobility, because students there react much more strongly to changing conditions than degree students would. As I said, we see a strong demand for Erasmus mobility in this academic year. And we see no signs so far for a loss of student interest in the real international experience, that is the offline international experience. I think Inge will talk about faculty mobility, but there, as you all know, with most conferences being canceled, or at least their offline component being canceled, many countries restricting travel of employees. We've seen a near breakdown of short-term faculty mobility in 2021, and it's recovering only slowly. Let me now come to the lessons, and I've just, I think, 3 or 4 minutes left. The lessons learned. I think it's important to make the case for physical mobility and for a return to physical mobility, which is irreplaceable, to make friends, to build networks, and to experience the unexpected, not the things that are in the curriculum, but the things you experience when you are living abroad. We will see many more online conferences and webinars, and this is a way of communications that's proved practical and easy, and that we will continue to use. The more so that higher education institutions and students have made a leap forward in the use of technology and will, of course, stick to that where it is appropriate. Still, I think it's necessary to say that we need to make intelligent use of technology. And let me just make 2 remarks in that regard. We frequently see international online teaching as just broadcasting the existing domestic program, without even the correcting factor of an international student body in the classroom. So instruction needs to be adapted if it's to be worthwhile in an international contact if it's online, and we need a specific pedagogy that is sensitive to intercultural difference and encourages intercultural interaction, which is not always the case, frankly. So it was good that higher education institutions reacted so resiliently at first, but it will take time to really adapt to the use of these media in an international context. Finally, I think it's important to strike a reasonable balance between what we've done in the past and what we were forced to do in the immediate past, and some of which we will keep for the future. I think we will need to resist the temptation of internationalization without mobility. There were some people preaching that a year ago. I think to remember at a UNICA seminar, for example. The more so that it costs less money. I think we need to make the case for physical international mobility. We shall use online interaction as a complement rather than a substitute for mobility. And we will need to be more inclusive and more sustainable. We needed to be so 2 years ago and 3 years ago, but we will continue to need to do that. And for example, there are tensions there. It is said that inclusion is easier with shorter stays or online instruction. On the other hand, particularly people from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds whose parents have not sent them to the United States for a year when they were at high school, physical mobility as students may be their first opportunity at all to really experience an international situation. So there are pros and cons, and I think individual institutions and funding agencies need to weigh those. Thank you so much for your attention, and if you have any questions, ask them or email me, and look at our website where you can read all the ACA think pieces. I've put my own in the handouts, which was a kind of a summary that I wrote a year ago. Thanks a lot.
Many thanks, Ulrich. I think that spoke to so many issues. What I picked up was particularly your strong point about physical mobility and serendipity. The fact that university education is not only about shoving some skills and competences down students' throats. It's about a holistic experience. Whereas, as I think you said very rightly, it's also what you didn't expect and what was not in the curriculum. The whole point about the use of technology, that we have done emergency learning online, but we still have a long way to go in terms of really digitally enhanced learning and teaching. I think that is worth a webinar series in itself, and we will actually have a webinar about that very soon at the UA. So you can stay tuned for that if that's your interest. So many thanks for that. Again, please write your questions to Ulrich in the chat, or not in the chat, in the Q&A. Important. And on that note, we'll look more on the research side and the open science aspect. I think the pandemic has, at least for people that work in policy, sort of been the standard argument for open science. Look, the pandemic, we could never have made it without open science. But Inge van Nieuwerburgh will now tell us a little bit more factually about what happens. Inge is coordinator for scholarly communication at the University of Ghent, basically just up the road from where I am in Brussels. So please, Inge, tell us.
Hi, everyone. Less facts and figures than the two previous speakers. I don't have a survey to rely on, but a lot of trends that we see arising in research lately. Did the pandemic help open science is the question. The question is also, did open science help the pandemic? Of course, it's two sides of the coin. And when we look at open science in this context, we have to look at information overload versus open science. Versus is maybe a strong word, but we have to keep in mind both concepts, because we see certainly in the last 2 years on COVID, there's an overload of information, a lot of things to digest. And in the digital world as a whole, we see a lot of gatekeepers around, and we see, for example, when you search in Google, you can end up in quite a tunnel in your own bubble, because it guides you through especially links that seem to be interesting to you. Versus with open science, we want to disseminate information as much as possible to anyone to access, and then you have to be able to find the information that you need, because it's not easy to do so. So sometimes it's a bit difficult to do so. But what do we mean actually when we talk about open science? And I wanted to stress that before I say something else about the consequences in the pandemic, because several things that the two previous speakers have talked about come together in open science. It's about collaboration. It's about global collaboration, not only within the own community. It's also about multidisciplinarity. And it's very important as well to give information to society and to exchange information with society. And that is what is very important in open science. It's the transparency of what happens. What we also see during the last few years, it has always been an effort, a challenge to do so, but the quality of information floating around is important to follow up on. And we have seen with the speed of exchange in the last few years that sometimes this could pose a problem. But we also saw an increase of attention for that. So actually in open science, this collaboration, this global view comes together and look across the fences. And it's important to see open science as responsible research and innovation, together with the concepts of public engagement, for example, and science education to understand what it's about. There has been a lot of talks, a lot said as well the last few months about equity. Equity, like an equal access to information. We have seen more and more equal access to information during the pandemic, but on the other hand, it was also difficult for some groups to get access and to disseminate their own research to the outside world. And the last few months have also shown that we should keep an eye on that. So it's not only about the information to get it out there, to let it flow throughout communities and to society, but we have to be careful that everyone can join this process. Now, in open science, we talk about the process of science, the process of doing research. So it's not only about results, it's about the whole process. And in the end, open science should just be a part of excellent science. And we saw that more open science concepts were integrated in research in the pandemic years, to say it like that. The first thing that we saw in the beginning of the pandemic is that many publishers opened COVID research to the world. Which was a good thing, because everyone could find the information, or even other information from other disciplines, because researchers could not access easily information from their desk in the university. They are at home, which wasn't always easy. So a lot was opened up for students and for researchers. But it was actually not really open access to these publications, because the publications were opened, but no open license was attached. So to really have open access, you need an open license that indicates what the use is. So there was this good trend that more information was opened, but on the other hand, it was still with a closed access that this information was disseminated. We saw the rise of preprints. Preprints have been around for almost 30 years in the open access movement. It actually started as a dissemination of preprints, the open access movement, to accelerate the access to current research. That's how it started. But we really saw a steep increase in the last 2 years. And I here cite Besançon et al. They did a study in 2021 on Open Science Saves Lives, Lessons from the COVID-19 Pandemic, so published in 2021. And they did an evaluation on publications and saw that there was a steep increase of preprints. So, for example, while 807 preprints were deposited in Met Archive in the 6-month period from the 1st of July 2019 to the 31st of December 2019. So 807 preprints were deposited. In the half year after that, the 6 months after that, it was almost 7,000 preprints. So we really saw a big increase of preprints. And preprints are a good thing for disseminating information very quickly to the research community. The researchers know how the process works, that you have to be careful with preprints because no peer review has been done yet on preprints. But what we also saw is that preprints were getting out into society. And certainly in the first months of the pandemic, journalists, for example, but many actors in society didn't really know how to appreciate these preprints. So it was clear that education was needed, for example, to journalists, how to treat these preprints. And luckily, many know already how to treat them. For example, we also saw it in the climate change conversations that more and more preprints were shared. And this is about an interview with Friederike Otto, in the Standaard, that's a paper in Belgium, on why she shares her preprints, and isn't that a problem? And she says that it's important to do that because that way we work in a transparent way, and we started already from a study with quite some quality parameters in place. But then again, still we need to make sure that they are dealt with caution. And that is really a lesson that we learn in preprints. Very good to share them, but people need to know how to treat them. A second trend is open peer review. It's actually a bit connected with the sharing of preprints, because when you share preprints, peer review is actually still has to be done. If we look at the whole situation of open peer review, we see that it happens more and more in the open. So this can happen on different levels. The text of the peer review can be shared without really disclosing who wrote the review, or everything can be open. The name of the reviewer and the text. Why would people not disclose their name? Well, it's sometimes difficult. It's for young researchers, or ethnicity can also play a part, that you don't want to be biased, get a biased opinion on your review just because of who you are. And so this is also about equity, actually. But we see open peer review come up more and more, as I said, certainly because there's already this trend of sharing of preprints. I was clicking the wrong button. And we see, for example, in Open Research Europe, the platform that the European Commission launched for publishing publications connected to projects that they fund, that there is preprint sharing and open peer review done afterwards on these preprints within this platform, and this will gain more and more attention. Of course, many are still a bit cautious about this, but we also see that there is more quality in the review text because it's out in the open. You're very careful in what you write out in the open, but it's a very transparent process in that way. Third thing to mention, of course, is open data, fair and open data. The findings that come out People want to know what is behind it. What's the data? What is the process behind it? What is the methodology behind it? And certainly on COVID-19, there's a lot of data out there. It was tons and tons of data that we saw circulating. But it also it also backed up the call to have more standardization, because a lot of data was out there that was not so easy to read, not so easy to interpret. And it really put a focus on the concept of fair data, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. What is the standard used for that data, the standardized form, the standardized exchange format, all these kind of things. What are the what's the license? What can you do with it? It stressed how important these concepts are. And then you see, luckily, that we were already quite prepared on open science, and that we, for example, within OpenAIRE, but in many other infrastructures, that the infrastructures were there to combine all these sources coming out, the open data, open publications, open software, and that we could combine this information and share it with the world. And that's how very quickly COVID-19 research gateways came up. So this is really has shown, it was really like a lens on open science and what the achievements of open science can be, and how it can help research in collaboration, multidisciplinary research. These gateways have shown that. Also in Zenodo, there is a gated community sounds wrong, a curated community, I mean, where only selected sources are, because they have to be on COVID-19, that come into this community of COVID-19 in Zenodo. And of course, there was this COVID-19 data portal of EMBL in Europe that combined all these resources. So conclusion is that there were some new trends coming up in the last 2 years, but most of the time it was a real enforcement of what was already there. Technically, the possibilities were there, but they were really taken up. Some negative, no, let's not say negative points, but some challenges came up that we certainly have to take with us with the future, on quality, on more and more focus on standardization that is needed, and really make sure that people who want to use this information, that they know what it's all about. And talking about emergency situations, we see, for example, that the European Commission and the Horizon Europe grant agreement has added an article for public emergency that all research results should be open with a non-exclusive license in a public emergency case. So some measures are up there, but open science has certainly helped the pandemic in the last few years, and open science has certainly grown within that period.
Thank you very much, Inge. That was extremely informative. So what it sounds is, it is a little bit the story that we know from digitally enhanced learning and teaching. It's not been a complete game changer, but it has been a change of gear. Something like this. This is more or less what I hear from you. So thanks to all of you. We have a lot of questions in the box here, and I'll start maybe by combining two, one from Martina Hartl and one from Alistair Creelman, about the green impact. So the awareness about the environmental impact of mobility, and I think the main thing here is flight tickets. What has been the consequences? What are the how do you see what has happened, and maybe what should happen in this regard? The whole greening debate, green mobility. I don't know who would take that. Maybe Ulrich, you go first.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. That issue was of course already there before the pandemic, though I'm afraid we were talking about it rather than taking concrete action. What I would see is that we will have much less 1 or 2 day travel than we've seen in the past. That we'll not go to Brussels for a 2-hour meeting and fly there. So I think that will definitely change. So the shortest term times of mobilities will be most affected and will be most probably be shifted to online media. At the other end of the spectrum is degree mobility that technically requires 1 flight go and 1 flight return that has a very, very limited impact in that regard. And that is one of the reasons why I don't really see, for that reason, degree mobility patterns to change very much. But what I do see that many institutions, individuals, and also funding agencies are now thinking on what they can do to avoid short-term, long-distance travel. For example, one foundation in Germany has decided that they will have a relationship between the length of travel and the minimal length of stay that they're going to support. So they will support a train ride from Germany to Austria regardless of duration of stay, but they will require students that travel to China or to Australia once they can again, to stay there for at least a month. And that may be a pattern, so that people are thinking, rather than traveling frequently short-term, to rather travel less frequently for longer periods of time and combine, for example, different reasons for travel. And I think that will also be true for credit mobility within and beyond Europe.
Thanks. And I think that speaks also to what was in your presentation about there might be a difference between how the effects play out on student mobility, where you say, you go take 1 flight out and 1 flight home, and sort of the more short-term academic mobility. And I think that speaks also to a question that Verena Jungi has on online conferences as a means to actually be more intense in your cooperation. I think Giorgio had also some evidence about that in his presentation. Giorgio, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Ulrich said. I think we need to think in the future to do the best with the tools we have. So it wouldn't make sense at all to fly or to travel just for 1 day to have a meeting, which can be done online much more effectively. But at the same time, we should not forget that we need human contact. So for some type of conference, we still need to meet, and especially what we saw at level of International Association of Universities, established cooperation online is very effective. So if you are collaborating with people you already know online, it works very well. But creating new collaboration and knowing people online, it's quite complicated. So we will still need some gatherings in order to have those moments outside the program where we can really have easy chats and know new people. That's one thing. And on the student mobility, that's again one thing that we have to keep in mind. There are a lot of initiatives to subsidize movement with less polluting means, like trains, for instance, instead of flights. But we also have to keep in mind not to be discriminatory in one sense, because, for instance, in Europe, it could be very easy to take a train to move from one place to another, but that might be so easy in Latin America or in Africa, because there are not so many trains. So we always have to think probably why we are doing a mobility. What is the purpose why we are doing it? We have to keep in mind the environmental impact, but we also have to look at the big picture. For instance, one thing that we're always defending, if we are doing mobility to make money out of it, that's probably it's bad and very bad for the environment, but also the reasoning behind is bad. So I think that we have to look at the holistic picture and make consideration before taking decisions.
Many thanks. Yeah, we need human contact after 2 years. That is very, very true. There's a different but very interesting question from Denis Kozanoglu about if the changes we've been and you must increase to a higher level. How we can do that international, if we've seen this increase in international cooperation, do we need to follow that up with new policies, new strategies, new international organizations? I think that speaks to both the let's say more learning and mobility angle, but perhaps also to the open science angle. So I just ask Inge, are universities dressed for a more intense open science?
That's another question. We see more, as you probably know, the EUA does an open science, the audience knows that the EUA does open science surveys once a year. There has been different aspects addressed, and one of them is, of course, what is open science policies in universities. And we see that there is an increase of open science policies in universities, but of course there's still quite a way to go regarding open science. Our universities in Europe, for example, are gearing up to support better fair data, research data management, and open access to publications. A lot, so that is really gaining importance in European universities, but still there's quite some room for improvement on other aspects of open science, like open source, open software, open methodologies, and things like that. So it's starting. And on open educational resources, it differs quite a lot across countries. So policy-wise, there's quite some things to do, but on the other hand, many universities, many countries are really determined to put steps there. And another impact there is also what will happen on research assessment side. How will open science practices be included in research assessment as being a good practice as part of excellent science? So there's some things to do as well. I don't know if that answers the whole question, but do we see that happen? And certainly with the increase of collaboration and need of cooperation across boundaries, openness of information is of knowledge and is very important.
Of course. Ulrich, you made a strong point about things might change in the way we do academic mobility, student stuff. Do we need new policies? Are we going to snap back to the old normal?
We will definitely need new policies, and be it only for the next crisis that we are facing right now. I think the pandemic has set in motion a process of nationalization and deglobalization that will probably deeply affect what universities do and what we do. And I think we need to find answers to those challenges, and they're not at all obvious. So my answer is yes, definitely.
Very, very interesting answer. Giorgio, do you have something short to say about that? Because there's one more question I want to take.
Very quickly, I agree with what Ulrich said, and I think we have to think about defending also academic freedom and institutional autonomy on that, because we will have more and more pressures from governments on which kind of partnership are acceptable or not.
Very good. Yeah, we had a whole webinar about this. It's on the YouTube playlist that is in the handouts about foreign interference and what is okay, what is not okay, and who decides that. I want to have one more question for Inge about preprints and more science communication, which you hinted at as well with science journalists, etc. And let's say the whole conspiracy theory, pseudoscience discourse that we've seen with the pandemic, and we've seen that very clearly in Belgium as well. How does that fit together with the complete openness to non-peer-reviewed papers that can be wildly interpreted depending on who writes them? How does that work out?
Yeah, well, some argue that indeed, with all the preprints coming out, and that some people might misuse or abuse the preprints to validate, let's say, fake news. That's one part of it, but also that some people might ingest fake news into preprints, for example. And then the argumentation is, with preprints, of course, everything is out in the open, and that in short term it can sometimes be difficult to tackle that, but in a bit longer term, that it comes up rather quickly what has quality and what is of bad quality. And so there are what I read about it and what I see about it is that it's mostly in the direction of, in the end, it's better, it's transparent, it's clear. And certainly then, if you combine it with open peer review, you see like the dialogue that is there, and it's transparent. But is it possible that some people misuse or abuse preprints to support their own fake news? It is certainly a possibility, but in the end, the transparency is better to have, and it's better to have it out in the open.
Thank you very much, and I think we need to stop it here. There are many other good questions, and we're touching on so many topics that are also beyond the whole idea about international cooperation, this science communication. One thing that EUA has learned during the pandemic is, of course, how good it is to do these webinars, and we will have webinars on many of the topics that we've talked about today. Later this spring, as I just said, science communication, also the role of universities in democratic debate. We have a whole series about that, so I watch out for that if that is your interest. But on these words, I want to say many thanks to our speakers. Many thanks to our good and very large audience from across the world. We will, in this series, have a little bit of an Easter break in April, but we'll be back in 2 months, exactly 24th of May, to talk about science diplomacy and what was mentioned here about international cooperation in a world that is maybe deglobalizing in the shadow of war. And that's something I'm personally looking very much forward to. We'll talk to the European Commission, we'll talk to the French presidency of the EU, and we'll of course also have a university voice on that. So on that note, I hope you all have a good afternoon, or a good rest of the day, or good evening, depending whether you're in the Americas or Asia. And many thanks again, and I hope to see all of you soon. The EUA webinar, maybe even in person. So thank you very much.